Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. And today I'm very, very lucky to have Sanjoy Roy, who is the founder and managing director of Teamwork Arts. And now Sanjoy is a bit different to some of the people I've had on the podcast before, because in the previous episodes, it's been a lot about technology and specifically technological advancements in the areas of AI, ML, to create sustainability, to create next gen businesses. But in today's world where creativity is really going to be what separates us as we move into this technological revolution, I'm very, very lucky to be speaking to Sanjoy Roy, who's really leading this with his company, Teamwork Arts. And they're really fostering creativity with events all over the world, ranging from music, literature, theater, and so much more. So Sanjoy, sorry for that long introduction. How are you?
I'm good, and thanks for having me online.
Of course, I'm very excited for this podcast because, like I said, it's exploring a new area of creativity. And I really want to ask you, by starting off, what's your background? Where did you grow up? How did this end up leading you towards starting Teamwork Arts?
Well, I've always been in theater, so even in school and university, that was pretty much my passion, the arts. And I mostly studied between the UK and Bombay, and then I completed my education in Delhi at the university. And then I've stayed on here. And while I was in university, I set up a theater group. And post that, I joined a theater group called Theater Action Group, which was sort of Delhi's most premier English theater company, where its artistic director was Barry John. And then I became its executive director in the early 80s. And thereafter, the idea was, how do we ensure that our colleagues in theater find adequate employment to allow them to continue theater? And it was in theater that I met my wife. And when we were to get married, my father-in-law asked me, "So, young man, what do you do?" And I said, "I do theater." So he said, "No, what's your day job?" So I said, "No, my day job is theater." And as we got closer to the wedding, he was like, "So how are you going to support my daughter?" And I was like, "Well, I thought she was going to support me because she was the manager of a big company."
Yeah.
That didn't amuse him at all. And yeah, as you can imagine. And at that point of time, television in India had just opened up. And our national carrier, Doordarshan, had just started putting out shows for private producers, etc. And a couple of them had kept, there was no television professionals per se. So people used to come to theater to look for talent. And Bobby Baby, who went on to make Bandit Queen and The Rising, etc., had come to me a couple of times saying, "Will you please join me and direct the series?" And I said, "No way, this is electronic media and I'm theater and, all of that kind of philosophical stuff. But as the wedding approached, my father-in-law was like, "You better get a job, young man. That's the job." So I joined Bobby, worked for a couple of years with him, and then Mohit Satyanand, who I met, who was also part of our theater company, was in business. So he and I then branched out and set up what now is Teamwork. It used to be Teamwork Films. We through the late 80s and into the early 90s till 1995, that's all we did, television and film. And because television had just opened up in India, we were one of the first movers. And there was no concept of a season. So if your show was successful and it had good TRPs, it ran forever, every day or every week, week after week, month after month, year after year. And by 1995 odd, I think we had about 14 daily or weekly soap operas, game shows, food shows, satire shows, news programs running. And we were somewhat like a factory. And it was on one very fateful Saturday afternoon. We used to have something called SAM, Saturday afternoon meetings, where we used to meet all our certain director colleagues to check who had to be written out in the next episode or what was the focus in the next episode. And two of our colleagues, Sharupa Datta and Manika, came into the room and said, listen, we cannot do this. And I'm like, why? And they said, we're brain dead. We don't have a life. We finish shooting at whatever, 10 o'clock at night. We get home at 1. We wake up at 6. We leave at 7. And day after day, week after week. And, television is unforgiving. It doesn't believe that anybody should have a personal life. So in a moment of weakness, I said, okay, if we don't want to do this, let's stop doing television, which was easier said than done, because when we went out to the television companies and said this was what the situation is, they were like, no way can you stop these shows, and they threatened us with all sorts of dire consequences. And it took us about 6 months to wind down, and we nearly went bankrupt. But as it happened in 1995 as well, Mohit and Kanika and his sister Kanika and another friend of ours, Val, a musician, had set up something called Friends of Music. And Friends of Music was supposed to be a platform for new music, meaning not Bollywood, not rock, but something in between. And that became very popular. It became a platform from which all of the sort of great innovative music groups have grown. Indian Ocean and Mrikya and Silk Route and Parikrama. It gave them all a platform. And so we did the same thing in theater. We commissioned new writing in theater. At that point of time, a lot of English theater was rip-offs of off West End and off Broadway. So we commissioned new writing in theater, and we did the same in dance. We went out to a lot of the great classical performers like Aditi Mangaldas and Daksha Sheth and Asta Debu and said, do stuff that is outside of your comfort zone. Let it be collaborative. And they then also created work, and we realized we had all of this content, but not enough platforms to showcase the content on. And meanwhile, in 1996, my wife had had an accident in Goa. We were holidaying, and because of the accident, I hadn't cut my hair for a bit. And our eldest son one day came to me and said, are you planning to grow your hair? So I said, why? So he said, if you grow your hair, you can't come to my school. So I'm going, yes! No, no more parent teacher day and no more, sports day and annual day and all of the stuff where the teachers then tell you as a parent how dismal you are. So I grew my hair, and my hair has always been perhaps more silver than black. And a lot of people used to think that, I ticked their box, especially in the UK. So I spoke their language, I looked creative, I sounded like I knew something. So I used to go out and lecture across the UK in universities and other places, and also taught arts management. And that led to creating a network, which then led to us setting up our first platform for work from India, which was contemporary, young, sexy, innovative, excellent, at the Edinburgh festivals. And as you know, the Edinburgh Festival is the world's biggest.
Right.
And once you get that kind of stamp, the rest sort of follows. And our first outing in Edinburgh was very successful. We presented across the many festivals that there were, not just in one festival. And that really was innovative for its time. And thereafter, we set up shop. Our first international festival outside of that was in Singapore. A colleague of ours, Shweta, had set up shop there. Singapore had just invested 1.3 billion Singapore dollars into the arts economy in Singapore, looking for people who could who could create and work with local communities there. And that's where our first offices and our first festival outside Edinburgh was. And then we grew into Australia, New Zealand, and now Hong Kong, Singapore, across Asia, Egypt, South Africa, Turkey, Morocco, UK, Europe, USA, Canada. And much of our belief primarily is that the arts can and does bring about change. And if there's one way we can do that is really through knowledge and through education. And that's why we make at least our literature program in India accessible to all kinds of people, free of cost. And we use the art then to try and see if we can push back on the narrative of fear and hatred, which seems to surround us today, and we work in countries where there is inequity and where there has been conflict.
Wow. Sanjoy, thank you for that. There's so much to unpack there, both from a business perspective to how you grew it, to the creativity portion. And I really want to expand on that area because that's a section of my podcast that I haven't really met with previous podcasts, and I think people will be very interested in. And you mentioned that you want to spread the importance of creativity and the value that can have to society. Can you kind of expand on that? How does it play such a huge role in society? How can it help people? How can people grow businesses from it? How can people make a living out of it? Could you expand on that?
Sure. As we all know, in recent times, especially in education, you have the arts and then you have the sciences. And we've been
Mhm.
saying for a long time that without the sciences, you can't really have the arts, and without the arts, you can't divine science. And you need both to work together to be able to, send man to the moon or create the best designs or build creativity into any process, be it management or be it business, because you need the reinvention or the reinventing. And much of that happens is if your left and right brain both work well together, and therefore the best nuclear scientists or scientists are also musicians or piano players, etc., because there
Mhm.
is a correlation, a shift between the two. And more today, as one can see, especially in when it comes to entrepreneurship or it's about creating disruption technology, you have to divine the other. And you can divine the other perhaps better if you look at something from different perspectives. Pretty much like the theatrical production, the film Rashomon, where you looked at the same truth from six different points of view or from six different perspectives. And none
Mhm.
of them really, it was not that one perspective was lying and was untrue. It was just that six people had six different ways of viewing that one incident. And when you do that and you're able to see that, okay, these can coexist in the same way that people can coexist, races can coexist, religions can coexist, people can coexist, nature can coexist. You then start looking at, okay, so what's the big issue of the fear factor that we're seeing today, where if refugees, for example, transit into countries which are comparatively safer, they're seen as a threat. Or minority status religions or people of color are
Mhm.
seen as a threat to dominant majority people. Because at the end of the day, if you look at humanity and human beings, if you're able to give everybody an equal playing field, you know, comparatively, uh, you can bring the best to bear. It's pretty much like when women were not included in the workplace, but today more and more there's an acceptance. So what is it that you're doing? You're saying that 49 or 50 or 51% of the population is now becoming productive and is a net contributor to the economy, whether it's working from home or
Mhm.
working at home or working in businesses or creating new value. And again, we know that each time there is a new input, you have necessarily a different output. And if you use or if you look at the arts and creativity as an input, uh, and envisage the fact that 2001 Space Odyssey was written, and and the writers divined the other, divined a future which was then made possible through science and technology. You can then look at the contribution that we are doing. On the other hand, you look at George Orwell's 1984, which he then divined at one point of time, which has come to pass. And I've always said writers and creators writers, they write and create not necessarily only to entertain. They do so because they have a volition to do so. If they don't do it, they will burst. And it's in that writing or creating, they sort of give us a perspective of the past, make sense of the present, and divine a future. And if you look at technology and the way technology today has disrupted economies and created value, disruptive value, way more in multiples than, say, regular brick and mortar industry. This has come up with not necessarily linear thinking, but
Mm-hmm.
thinking in a creative strain, collaborating and working together. If you just look at the technology giants today, they buy and sell and collaborate with patents. So Apple will buy Samsung, Samsung will look at something from Microsoft. And while they all may be looking at different aspects, they've realized that coming together, you can create a better product without necessarily reinventing the wheel. So imagine a creative platform which is accessible to everybody and the world, uh, across, which has been made democratically accessible through technology. And then each of these million or billions of people has an idea that rises up like a firefly in the night and illuminates us all collectively with that shining light.
Wow. That that kind of sounds like this last point that you made. It kind of sounds like the utilitarian perspective of what social media could be for us. You know, social media does connect us and it does collaborate us, and it could be this breeding ground, which it is, um, to amazing creativity. But sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't go that way. But I really like that point, and I really like the point you made also on where science and creativity converge, and that's where we really get the best of whatever projects we're trying to do. Because I agree with you, and I feel one of the reasons our education right now in India could be improved is not really enabling kids to work that creative mindset. They're only working the memorization mindset. So I really, I really, really like that point. And I just want to go into one more aspect of what you talked about in, your introduction. Was it seems like you've always followed your, whatever your thought was. It didn't feel like, or whatever your passion was. It didn't feel like you had a set plan like you talked about. And so could you talk about, following your passion as well, like, and the importance of that in
Well,
the long run?
Arman, when you have long hair, you have limited options. It's not that a bank job. So, yeah, I mean, pretty much, I was pretty much clear from the beginning. I'll give you an example. In university, I went to Delhi University, St. Stephen's College, where all my peers and my colleagues were, everybody applied necessarily to the United States or to the UK to go and study in their third year, and so did I. And I got admission into Berkeley and USC and a program in Sweden. And but I was running a theater group, and it never even occurred to me that this was a possibility. I mean, I'm sure if I'd taken it on, maybe life's trajectory would have been completely different, and I would be doing different things. But I suspect that even then, my heart was pretty much in the arts, and that's all I know how to do. And because the arts, people, again, like I said, we tend to box everything. If you're in science, you're science. If you're in education, you're education. If you're in the arts, you're that other person who is always out looking for some kind of money or grant or whatever. But my thing is that the arts allows you that perspective to have this 360-degree view of the world. I mean, my world is an intersection of science and technology and economics and politics and philosophy and music and theater. And, the high points is when you're sitting in a theater, and I sit in theaters a lot and I see a lot of rubbish as well. But it's that time when the curtain opens and there's a sense of anticipation, and then you see this incredible performance, which gets your soul soaring and your heart singing. Or you see this wonderful invention, or we work a lot with museums in different parts of the world. These are institutions that, when you have long hair, you get to go and do the blah blah too in terms of the neck,
Yeah.
big ears and stuff.
Hmm.
But that's where you see the sheer excitement of the other, of divining something that brings together technology, creativity, uh, science, process. Process is super important. And again, when you're looking at process, sometimes we tend to dismiss process because it's not the end result. All of us continue to only look to the end result. But if you are creative in your process, and I don't mean creative in the Trump way of looking at taxes, but just creative in the way that you uh, uh, relook at a process. And I
Yeah.
remember, 6 or 7 years ago when we took in some investment, and our investment guys sent in, business consultants to look at our processes. And every time he came back to me with a presentation, I mean, I love learning, so I'm like always open to anybody who is up to teach me something. I just love learning. And I was like, you know, we are not a company making yogurt, and we're not a company doing cold chain process, but you're
Hmm.
trying to put in processes that makes us that. Creativity is not standardized, and each person will look at it differently. I'll give you an example. One of the hats that I wear is I help set up a trust called the Salam Balak Trust for street and working kids, and these are kids who run away from home or are in difficult circumstances. They come and live with us. We have about 9,500 kids a year that lives in our centers in Delhi. And our primary program there, because these kids are pretty traumatized, is to use the arts. And today, so many of them, whether it's completing their scholarship engineering program in the United States or becoming aeronautical engineers, or Vicky Roy, who's one of the most sought after photographers, his work today sits in museums across the world, etc. So you give these people a platform to be able to achieve their optimum level of excellence. And you'll see that the world will be able to redefine itself and tackle some of the problems that we have. Even today, we're setting up a new platform for innovation and technology. And much of what I'm seeing there is young people looking at simple solutions to sort out some of the planet's more difficult problems.
Wow. Wow. And I thank you for that. And I want to be cognizant of your time because I know you have to run somewhere else. So I want to ask you one other question that's been on my mind, especially with education. Um, can anyone be creative? Are you born creative? Is it something that's fostered? Is it something that is innate in all of us? Or is it something that has to be taught? Could you expand on that question? Because I think a lot of us struggle with it. In school, you're told you're good at drawing or you're not good at drawing. You're good at acting, you're good at singing, or you're not. Could you expand on, this point?
Man is born creative. We spend the rest of the time either shutting it down or telling man not to do this or not to do that. Even as kids, it's always about no, you can't do, no, you can't touch this, no, you can't touch that, you can't go here, you can't read this, you can't read that. Man has an innate ability of curiosity and to discover the other. If they didn't, we wouldn't be on the moon today. Everybody, the entire planet, 7 billion of us, have a DNA of creativity built into us. So when somebody says you can't paint, that's fine. Can you cook? If you can't, that's fine. Can you compute a new code? That's okay. Can you garden? Can you look at different ways to play with mud? Everybody is creative. Our education system worldwide tries to box you into, because you can paint and we can see it, it's an end product, you're creative. Your mind is working 24/7. And that is what needs to be harnessed. And if you're able to harness that at a young age, and today more and more uh, creches and educational programs are trying to do that, you will see, especially the new generation, what they call is the indigo kids, anybody born after 1990 or 1995, they're all connected. They all have an innate sense of responsibility to the planet and to each other, except that we go around screwing that up as adults and just saying that no, you can't, or no, you shouldn't, or you're not capable, or you're not good enough, and no two people will be as good or as bad as each other. Each will have their own individual strengths, and it is that you have to figure out what is it that works for them. I'll give you an example. One of the kids who came to us was a kid, pretty much like a Jungle Book story. He had been brought up by animals in the jungle in Andhra Pradesh, in the south of India, didn't have any language except the language of birds and animals, etc. The court system as it works, he finally landed up at Salam Bala Trust, and very, 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 very unhappy to be locked into these four walls. But after a while he started adjusting, and then at some point, the tree outside his window he tried to set fire to, and we realized that the reason he was doing that was that it was pulling him back to his intrinsic relationship with nature. And he was, without language, he was one of the most creative kids one has seen, because he lived with nature. So he had an intrinsic natural knowledge. So finally, working with the authorities, we returned him to a place pretty much close to nature where he could then continue his intrinsic knowledge and use some of the other man-made devices that we have. So yeah, even the most unlettered folks who don't have any language for themselves can really get ahead of themselves by just being allowed to be.
I think that's a very strong point on how it is innate in all of us, whether it be through technology or arts or in nature. I think I completely agree with that point, and I think that's a great place to end up. And Sanjoy, I want to thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I learned a lot from it.
Many thanks, Arman. Happy to do this chat any other time that you want. I'm sorry I'm having to run, but best wishes, and hope your podcast continue and you stick to doing what you think you wish to do, and just follow your heart and the rest will follow.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk soon.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.